Hello everybody, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and in today's video we'll be talking about a very important topic of political science for the CSS exams, and it is related to the difference and the similarities between the political philosophy of Plato and Aristotle. So in our last three videos we briefly touched upon the major ideas of Plato and Aristotle's political philosophy. We talked about them in detail. We also presented our criticism points on them. But in this video, I'll be moving a step forward and will present a comparison and a set of similarities between these two philosophers, because these two philosophers are very important from the point of view of exam, and they set the base of a student's understanding of political philosophy. And if you have examined the 2025 exam of political science, you will be seeing that the first question is about critical analysis of Plato and Aristotle's political philosophy. So for that purpose, one must know the major differences and similarities between them. So we'll be moving forward and talking about the differences and the similarities between the political philosophy of these two philosophers. So first we'll be talking about the differences between the two, because the differences between them are greater in number than the similarities that they have. So the first difference between these two philosophers is rooted in their focus. For example, Plato talks about idealism, whereas Aristotle is more of a realist person. So Plato believes in how things should be in nature, or how they should be done, how they should be proceeded further. Whereas when we talk about Aristotle is someone who takes into account the real time challenges, the resources at hand. He understands that he talks about how the things should be carried out considering the situation that the people are living in. So Plato's focus is on ideal forms and utopias, while Aristotle studies real world and city states. And then, of course, the second point of difference is the methodology. Plato believes in abstract theory and reason, whereas Aristotle believes in observation and classification. Now, Plato uses deductive reasoning, whereas Aristotle is empirical, observing real systems. When we say that Plato is deductive, which means that he believes in how things should be. He believes in, an idea, and then he presents different facts to prove his point. Whereas Aristotle, as we also discussed his political philosophy before, we discussed that Aristotle was someone who believed in constitutionalism, and he studied about 158 constitutions, and after reading and analyzing, observing the different kinds of constitutions, he presented his classification of government, and he presented a way through which he believed that governance and politics should be administered. And then, of course, he talks about they also talk about the purpose of state. So Plato particularly focuses on moral perfection of the individual, as we see through the system of education and the classification of the society in different groups, and also through the entire idea of the philosopher king and ideal state. He kind of promotes the idea of moral perfection. But on the other hand, when we talk about Aristotle is someone who believes in happiness and self-sufficiency, even in his controversial ideas like that of the status of women and the normalization of slavery. He kind of promotes the idea that everything is natural in a way that happiness should be secured. And he says that the kind of differences that have been created in society is something that make the individual self-sufficient. He does not talk about any kind of deprivation that these classes feel, and he does not focus entirety of his philosophy does not revolve around morality. He does focus on morality and virtue and justice, but that is not the only thing that his philosophy is all about. So we can say that basically Plato's ideal state exists to create virtuous souls, and Aristotle aims for collective well-being. So moving forward to the fourth point, which is the role of law. Now, law in Plato's political philosophy has less importance. He does not particularly focus on the legal system or how laws should be governed. He talks about communism of wives and property, and he talks about the how in different strata of society it should be governed and administered. But he does not talk about a legal system. He does not talk about punishment or things of that sort. But when you talk about Aristotle's idea is based on constitutionalism. So it is basically central to political life. The law is very important. So, so we can kind of say that Plato trusts philosopher kings to rule by wisdom, whereas Aristotle emphasizes written law. when we studied Plato's political philosophy, we studied that he had so much faith in the wisdom and the intellect of the philosopher king that laws were something that were considered synonymous to the words of the philosopher king. Whereas Aristotle does not give that much of importance to leaders. Of course, he does say that to be a good citizen, you need to have all those leadership skills and great interest into the into the life of the individuals. But he gives more importance to written laws. He had a more codified notion towards, the role of law. Then if we talk about ideal rulers, so we all know that Plato believed in the philosopher king, whereas Aristotle believed in mixed government. He believed in middle class rule. He basically, for him, middle class was you must have property, you must have education. When you look when you look into the interests of the middle class of any country focuses on these two three things. They focus on good law, they focus on having private ownership, they focus on education. So in this way, we can say that Aristotle was someone who believed in mixed government and in the middle class rule. Mixed government because he presented different, he classified the governments. He also talked about one person rule, he talked about rule by few person, and then he also talked about rule by many. And of course, within this classification, he made a distinction between which was positive and which was negative, which is of course debatable. But he kind of had very open idea. He was open to new things and different notions. So, of course, Plato's ideal ruler was a very wise and enlightened monarch, whereas Aristotle supports balanced governance. And then when we talk about their view on democracy, of course, Plato had a very negative notion towards democracy, and he believed that democracy was basically amateurish meddlesomeness, which was the rule of ignorant masses. Why he said this? It was because, of course, he had seen how Socrates died and the entire political turmoil that happened at that time. Whereas when we talk about Aristotle had a moderate criticism towards it. He says that, if it is balanced, if there are some terms and conditions which are worked upon, democracy can be a better form of governance. But if we remember when he talks about the rule of many, he talks about polity, and then he talks about democracy. So democracy is still a negative form of government for him, but he kind of promotes the idea that if it is regulated, if people who are more invested in the interests of the individuals of the state, if such people are given leadership positions, then maybe in one way or another democracy is something that can be favored. And that is why we see that Plato considers democracy as mob rule, whereas Aristotle sees potential if it includes middle class control. Then justice was very important for both of these philosophers. For Plato, justice was about each person doing their natural role, and for Aristotle it was about lawfulness and equality under law. Now, for Plato, we can consider it with, we can link it with social harmony. It can be taken in terms of, non-interference principles, independence of each social group within society. And for Aristotle, we can see it in terms of legal fairness. And education, of course, state-controlled and strict curriculum was promoted by Plato, and Aristotle, on the other hand, did give a lot of importance to education. He considered it vital, but still, it was something that was needed to be governed by the constitution. He had read different constitutions, and not every constitution promoted a system of education very strictly and profoundly. So he was like, yes, education is important, but what kind of education, he was like, you need to look into your surroundings and see what is the need and demand. Only then such a system of education should be introduced. So you see that, for Plato, it was central to the state control and state management, whereas Aristotle tailors it to regime. Like, depends on what kind of regime there is. If there's monarchy, then it really varies if the monarch wants to have a strong system of education or not. If there's oligarchy, then of course does that group of people who want to usurp the power, have total control, want to have any kind of education system or not. So it's basically varying. He kept room open to interpretations. And then when we talk about property, of course, Plato is infamous for the abolishment of property for ruling class, and Aristotle, he advocates the idea of private property. And Plato particularly abolished private property among guardians. He talked about leading a life very moderately, living in barracks and just living for the purpose of state's wellness. And Aristotle, on the other hand, focused on private ownership, because for him, a person who has private ownership is someone who could, genuinely and honestly and justly participate in the economic affairs of a state, and, be a good citizen. And when we talk about the role of women, so Plato, in his theory, says that the role of women in ruling class in opportunities of education is equal to that of the men. Whereas when we talk about Aristotle's political philosophy, he has kind of, given women a subordinate position. He says that women have a domestic role more than a political or, social role. And Plato is surprisingly progressive in that sense. And Aristotle views women as biologically inferior. And then, of course, slavery. And both of these philosophers kind of justify slavery. So then the question arises that where is the difference? So the difference is here that Plato accepts slavery as a natural order of the society. He believes that, the economy of Greece is dependent on slave economy, and the slavery was, the idea of slavery at that time was so common that he thought it was not so important to discuss it in his political philosophy. It was something that was intrinsically known and accepted. But when we talk about Aristotle, Aristotle kind of, justifies it through binary oppositions, through binary divisions in society. The way we say it's day and night, the way we see men and women. At the same way, he talks about natural slavery in terms of master and slave. They both do justify slavery, but the notions with which they justify slavery is different. Aristotle systemizes it, through his theory of natural slaves, and Plato does not really talk about it in his theory, but of course, it was something that was accepted by him because he did not, during his time in his writings, he did not criticize slavery. And then, of course, art and literature. So Plato saw art and literature as an imitation of distrust, which means that it was something that Plato believed would lead the people, the youth, astray, and would make them follow a path that they should not follow, because that would eventually lead to the deterioration of the state and, an individual being a moral or a virtuous soul. On the other hand, when we talk about Aristotle, Aristotle focuses on education and moral value, and he does not particularly focus on art or literature's censorship. He basically believes that if art and literature is something that would nourish the soul, that would help them make better citizens, then it should be, widely accepted and recognized. So, that is why we see that Plato bans poets from the Republic, and Aristotle allows art that promotes virtue. So basically, that's conditional art and literature that Aristotle promotes. And then ideal state concept. Because, of course, city-states were very common. They were the major, we can say the prototype that were used to describe the administration or politics by the political philosophers. So Plato kind of divided the ideal state into three classes. We know there were the rulers, auxiliaries, and producers. And Aristotle, on the other hand, promoted the idea of polity. He believed that polity is something that was, a mixed and moderate regime, which was a slightly better version of democracy. In democracy, as we discussed it earlier, that everyone has right to speak, to have ownership, to have education and everything. But in polity, it's like if you are deserving, if you have that spark in you to be a good citizen, then only you'll be granted the citizenship and the leadership role and the acceptance in the political affairs. So that is why we can say that, Plato kind of, he promoted a hierarchical system, whereas Aristotle prefers constitutionalism and moderation. Because if you look at Plato's idea of polity, it focuses on moderation, and it reflects that he has studied a lot of constitutions and he wants a system that works much better in terms of administration. Then change and reform is very important, because in any political philosophy, if there is room for moderation, for change, for growth, evolution, that philosophy is considered a success. But if there's a philosophy which does not talk about any kind of innovation or, future prospects, then that philosophy is considered very restricted in its nature. So if we talk about Plato, Plato was kind of very skeptical in his approach to change and reform, because he sticks to the concept of ideal state. He sticks to the idea of, idealism and the perfect picture that should be of how things should be. Whereas when you look at Aristotle, Aristotle talks about a natural change. He talks about evolution as well, if you remember. He talks about how there's an individual, there's a family, there's a town, there's a tribe, and then there's state, which is the highest form of association. So he's also known as a practical reformer in that sense. Not only is this, but I think we can also relate it with the different classification of governments that he presents, in which he talks about, one person ruled by many people, and then ruled by such a more greater number of people. So in that way also we can analyze his, practical reformation. And that is why we see that Plato resists any kind of political change. That is why there is so much, you can say, censorship. And, K.R. Popper also called Plato for this purpose as the father of totalitarianism and fascism. However, Aristotle, on the other hand, he studied revolutions, and he studied, reformations, reforming mechanisms, and all such things. Even when we study criminology, in that particular subject also, when we talk about punishment and crime, we study about Aristotle being a reformer, in sense that he believes in classical theory of criminology, stating that, individuals can commit crime, but there is kind of a thing that there should be a room, basically a room for them in terms of acceptance. We can talk about it in some other class. Hopefully when I start my criminology classes, at that time we can discuss about this in detail. And then of course, the topic of concept of citizenship is very important. So basically, citizenship means the feeling of being accepted in any state. And how do you feel accepted in any state? When you participate in the major affairs of the state. So Plato talked about it by saying that, the idea of citizenship is limited to philosopher rulers. Philosopher kings are those people who are actually the owners of the state. They are the ones who actually enjoy the perks of citizenship, because they are actively participating in the economic affairs, political affairs, foreign affairs, and all such things. Defense affairs as well. And whereas when you talk about Aristotle says that the idea of citizenship is broad. It is conditional, but it is broad, and it is linked to virtue and participation. So in that way, we can say that Plato resists political power to the wise, whereas Aristotle sees citizenship as political engagement. And yes, these were certain differences between the two classical philosophers. Okay, so now you can see this, list of differences that we have discussed. It's quite possible that there could be a few spelling mistakes in this picture, but I just, kind of made this so that you can take a screenshot and save it for your quick revision or stuff like that. I hope it helps you guys. Okay, so now we'll be discussing the similarity between the two political philosophers. So the first aspect of similarity between them is the ethical foundation. So basically, politics and ethics are deeply connected in classical philosophy. And we see that both philosophers see the goal of politics as creating a virtuous life. Now, if you individually pick up the political philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, and if you analyze it, we see that their prime idea or their prime goal is to lead a virtuous life. Ethics is so important for them. And this is, true for all for all classical philosophers. And then we talk about education's role. Now, the similarity is that education is central to state building and virtue for both the philosophers. Of course, the way with which they approach towards the idea of education and the way they, promote education is very different. But still, education as a whole, as an umbrella idea, is very close to the major foundational philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, as both emphasize education in shaping citizens through though their methods differ. And then critique of democracy. Both distrust extreme democracy. Aristotle and Plato, they are not, they do not speak very high, or they do not speak very highly of democracy. They believe that democracy is a system that kind of creates a lot of chaos and anarchy, and also it promotes amateurish meddlesomeness, as said by Plato. And Plato, that is why he also considers very chaotic, and Aristotle warns against majority tyranny. Even though you see that Plato in his political philosophy promotes authoritarian rule of philosopher king, but still he believes that is better than the rule of many people than democracy, because what happens in the authoritarian rule of philosopher king is that philosophy is leading, philosophy is ruling. So he believes that philosophy kind of still has a lot of ethical value in it, a lot of love for moral virtues and individuals, in comparison to democracy, which is only it is fueled by the idea of individualism and self-interest. And if you look deep into the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, both of these philosophers completely loathe individualism and high esteem for self. They promote love for citizens and love for the state. And then, of course, dislike for tyranny. Tyranny for both of them is the worst form of government. Both oppose absolute power and rule by passion or greed. So for Aristotle, it is still understandable, because he kind of justifies, through the different classification, through the classification of government, the different rules, and how, maybe monarchy could be good for people and all that stuff. And he says that despotism is basically tyranny, and that is bad, because any form of government that imposes certain things on people, or that is very authoritarian in its nature, is bad. For Plato, why he says that tyranny is bad, whereas this is also criticism that his his philosopher king is very tyrant in nature and very authoritarian in nature. But he kind of justifies it, that philosopher king cannot go wrong, because philosopher king is he is kind of guided by morality and virtue and ethics. And he believes that that is why the philosopher king is someone whose wisdom will guide the state. And he believes that the purpose of making philosopher king the king is that philosophy kind of grounds you. So he believes that it is unnatural for a philosopher king to be tyrant. If he's doing something that comes into the ambit of authoritarianism, it is basically for the betterment of citizens. It is basically for infusing ethical morality in individuals, not for making them suffer. So you need to look deep into the nature, or the purpose, or the intention of what his philosophy is. And then both believe state is natural, and both believe that man is a social slash political being. Of course, Aristotle says that man is a political animal, but and he also kind of justifies it through his idea of association, of natural evolution of human, first being an individual, then being a part of a family and town, and then state, which is the highest form of association. For Plato, it is also very true, because for Plato, he kind of justifies man being, or state being, natural, and man being a social political animal, by justifying the hierarchy in society through the idea of justice, harmony, self non-interference, self-reliance, different classes in society working in their own domain, yet they're very important to each other. So you see, you need to know the philosophy. If you are well aware with the main idea, intention of these both philosophers and their political philosophy, it's very easy for you to understand their differences and the similarities, because there are certain points that fall both into the similarity and the differences, but the difference is in the way they approach, and the similarity is the greater umbrella idea, which kind of binds their philosophy together and makes them fall into the category of classical philosophers of political science. And these both philosophers are very important, and most of the times these both philosophers are asked in comparison, or in in contrast. So it is very important it's very important to have a great understanding of this. So this was the video for today. I hope you liked it. Now we'll be moving forward and discussing other important philosophers that are pertinent to know for the political science exam of CSS. And please let me know about the video, whether you liked it or not. Thank you.